Hello, friends. Tonight, we're taking a slow, gentle journey back to a time when winter wasn't just a season you endured between heating bills. It was a way of life, a teacher, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, even a friend. Picture this. No alarm clock shrieking at dawn, no rushing to catch trains, no endless notifications demanding your attention. Just the soft, inevitable rhythm of survival, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the gentle turning of days, the gradual shortening of light, and the quiet satisfaction of small tasks completed with care. We're going back about 700 years, to a world where time moved differently, where a day's work meant exactly that, working with the day, not against it, where winter arrived like a familiar relative who stayed perhaps a bit too long, but who everyone learned to accommodate with a mixture of patience, creativity, and surprisingly good humor. So please, pull your blanket a little closer. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of falling snow. Feel the weight of your pillow, the warmth of your covers, the blessed certainty that you're safe and comfortable. Because tonight we're visiting people who knew how to find contentment in far simpler things, a fire that caught well on the first try, a pot of soup that actually tasted like something other than boiled optimism, a roof that mostly kept the weather outside where it belonged. This isn't a story about suffering, though there certainly was some. It's not about how terrible the past was, though it had its challenges. Instead, it's about resilience dressed in everyday clothes, about communities that understood survival was a team sport, about ordinary people who discovered extraordinary patience, who learned to laugh at situations that probably weren't very funny at the time, and who somehow managed to pass down through the generations the quiet art of enduring with grace. Tonight, you don't need to solve anything, fix anything, or worry about anything. You're simply a visitor to a time when the problems were simpler, even if solutions were harder to come by. A time when the biggest decision of the day might be whether to use the good firewood now or save it for later. Whether the chicken outside was making normal chicken noises or something is definitely wrong chicken noises. These are stories told in the rhythm of spinning wheels and chopping axes, measured in the slow tick of seasonal time. Stories of people who understood that the best way to survive winter was together, sharing warmth, sharing worries, sharing the occasional good joke about the neighbor's goat who somehow always managed to escape at the most inconvenient moments. So dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum that sounds a little like wind through thatch roofs. Let your mind settle into the gentle pace of medieval time, where rushing was reserved for emergencies and most of life happened at exactly the speed it needed to. Let's begin our quiet journey to a season that didn't just test people, it taught them. And tonight, it might just teach us something about the gentle art of slowing down. Winter's quiet arrival. Winter announced itself gently in medieval times. The way sleep creeps up on you after a long day so gradually that you barely noticed until you were already there, blinking in surprise at how the world had quietly transformed around you. It began with the light, really. Not the dramatic shift you might expect, but something far more subtle. The sun started taking longer coffee breaks, rising a little later each morning as if it too had grown weary from the long work of summer. By afternoon, it would already be thinking about calling it a day, casting those golden, slanted rays that made even the humblest cottage look like something from a gentle dream. The frost arrived like a polite visitor, at first only appearing on the most delicate surfaces, the tips of grass blades, the edges of puddles, the morning dew that had decided to crystallize overnight just to see what all the fuss was about. Farmers would step outside to tend their animals and find the world dusted with tiny diamonds, as if someone had been very busy with a salt shaker while everyone slept. Animals, being far wiser than humans in these matters, began their own quiet preparations. Chickens grew fluffier, as if someone had whispered to them about the coming cold and they'd responded by investing in better insulation. The village cats started appearing more frequently by fireplaces, not begging exactly, but making themselves available for lap duty with the kind of strategic positioning that would make a chess master proud. Dogs began that peculiar autumn behavior of following their humans more closely, not out of anxiety, but with the practical understanding that humans were the ones with opposable thumbs and therefore control over doors, fires, and most importantly, the distribution of warm sleeping spots. Even the mice seemed to sense the change, though they expressed this awareness primarily by becoming incredibly industrious about relocating into people's homes, not maliciously. You understand, they were simply practicing medieval real estate principles, which essentially boiled down to location, location, location. And the location they preferred was anywhere that involved stored grain and minimal cat supervision. The wind began to change its tune, shifting from the gentle summer breezes that barely stirred the leaves to something with a bit more purpose, a bit more direction. It started finding in the gaps between roof tiles, around door frames, through the spaces where one log met another. Not rudely, not violently, just with the quiet persistence of water finding its way downhill. Village children, those remarkable barometers of seasonal change, began staying closer to home, their games shifting from the wide-ranging adventures of summer to more domestic pursuits. Suddenly, helping with household tasks didn't seem quite so tedious when the alternative was standing in a field wondering why your fingers had stopped working properly. The very air began to feel different, cleaner somehow, sharper, as if it had been practicing to carry the weight of snow. Breath started to fog on particularly chilly mornings, causing children to discover the magical power of pretending to be dragons. At least until their parents reminded them that dragons didn't typically help with the churning. Markets began to take on a different rhythm too. Less of the casual browsing of summer, more of the purposeful acquiring of things that would matter when the world turned white. Vendors started mentioning the weather more frequently, not as small talk, but as genuine information sharing. Cold one coming, they'd say, with the kind of certainty that came from watching the same seasonal patterns for decades. People began walking just a little differently, not faster, but with more intentionality. Summer allowed for meandering, for taking the long way, for stopping to chat with neighbors about nothing in particular. But as autumn progressed toward winter, steps became more direct, more purposeful, not rushed but focused. Even the evening light changed quality, becoming something precious, something to be savored rather than taken for granted. Families found themselves gathering earlier around whatever warmth they could create, drawn together not just by the coming cold, but by some ancient understanding that winter was best faced as a team sport. And then, one morning, you'd wake to find that overnight, without any grand announcement or dramatic flourish, winter had simply arrived, not with a storm or a blizzard, but with the quiet confidence of a season that knew it belonged, settling in like an old friend who planned to stay for quite a while. The world had turned patient, and somehow, so had the people in it. Preparation for winter in medieval times wasn't the frantic, list-checking rush of modern seasonal changes. It was more like a gentle choreography that families had been practicing for generations, where everyone knew their part in this slow, seasonal dance. Picture it as a kind of village-wide meditation on the theme of getting ready, not the getting ready that involves checking 17 weather apps and ordering supplies online, but the getting ready that happened at the pace of seasons themselves, deliberate, unhurried, and surprisingly thorough. The harvest had already happened, of course, but now came the quieter work of making sure everything found its proper place for the long wait ahead. Root vegetables were persuaded to take up residence in root cellars, where they would spend the winter in dark, cool contemplation, hopefully avoiding the philosophical question of whether they were still alive or had transcended to some higher vegetable state. Apples, those cheerful optimists of the fruit world, were carefully arranged in storage areas where they could practice their winter hobby of very slowly turning into something that was either cider or vinegar, depending on their mood and the ambient temperature. Medieval people had learned to work with whatever the apples decided to become flexibility, being a key survival trait when you couldn't exactly run to the store if your preservation methods got creative. Grain found itself measured, sorted, and tucked away in containers that were locked, blessed, and guarded with the kind of attention usually reserved for treasure chests, because in winter, that's essentially what they were. Every kernel of barley, every grain of rye represented not just calories, but possibility, the possibility of bread, of soup, of making it through February without having to seriously consider whether the roof thatch might be edible if prepared correctly. The art of firewood gathering took on an almost ritualistic quality. Families would venture into forests with the solemnity of pilgrims, searching not just for any wood, but for the right wood dry enough to burn well, substantial enough to last, small enough to carry without requiring engineering degrees to figure out the logistics. Children learned early that firewood was like time itself, always more valuable than you realized until you started running out. They developed an almost mystical ability to spot good kindling, tiny hands gathering twigs and branches with the focused intensity of treasure hunters. Parents would watch their offspring return from these expeditions, arms full of nature's offerings, and feel that particular mix of pride and mild concern that comes from watching small people take on responsibilities that actually matter. House maintenance became a community affair, not because people were particularly social, but because many hands made light work, and light work was the only kind anyone could afford. Neighbors would appear without being asked, carrying tools that had seen better decades, ready to help patch roofs that had been promising to leak for months and had finally made good on that threat. These repair sessions were surprisingly cheerful affairs. There's something about shared misery that brings out the best in people's sense of humor. Someone would inevitably tell the story about the time old Henrik's roof collapsed and how he'd simply looked up at the sky and remarked that he'd always wanted better ventilation anyway. The process of winterizing homes was an exercise in creative problem solving. Gaps between logs were stuffed with whatever was available: moss, cloth scraps, dried grass, and sometimes the hopes and dreams of families who were really hoping this winter wouldn't be the one that tested their construction skills too severely. Windows, such as they were, received special attention. Oiled parchment or cloth would be carefully positioned to let in light while keeping out the worst of the wind, creating a kind of medieval compromise between seeing where you were going and not freezing while you got there. Food preservation took on the quality of an art form. Salt became more precious than jewelry, used with the kind of careful precision that would make a master chef proud. Smoking meats was a process that required patience, attention, and the ability to maintain just the right kind of fire for days at a time. Too hot, and you'd cook the meat instead of preserving it. Too cool, and you'd essentially be creating jerky-flavored disappointment. Communities developed their own rhythms around these preparations. Families would take turns using shared resources: the village oven for baking large batches of bread, communal spaces for smoking meats, shared tools for the heavier work that required more than household implements could handle. There was something deeply satisfying about this kind of preparation. Unlike modern winter prep, which often feels like battling an approaching enemy, medieval winter preparation felt more like welcoming an old friend you knew would be challenging company, but who always left interesting stories in their wake. By the time the first serious frost arrived, villages had taken on that settled, ready quality of places where people had done their homework. Not perfect preparation. Perfection was a luxury medieval life rarely afforded, but thorough enough, careful enough, community-minded enough to face whatever winter decided to bring. And somehow that was always enough. The first snow, nature's gentle transformation. And then one morning, it happened. Not with fanfare or dramatic weather warnings, but with the quiet magic that only winter knows how to create. You'd wake up and know immediately, even before opening your eyes, that something fundamental had changed overnight. The world had gone soft. That's the only way to describe it, really. Where yesterday there had been the familiar sounds of autumn leaves rustling, birds chattering, the general busyness of a world still in motion. Now there was something different, a gentle hush, as if the entire landscape had decided to speak in whispers. Opening the door was like opening a book that was a page written in a completely different language. The village you'd known for your entire life had been transformed into something from a gentle dream. Snow had fallen like a blessing, turning every rough edge smooth, every harsh line graceful. It wasn't deep. This first snow just enough to change everything. enough to make the thatched roofs look like they'd been frosted by some cosmic baker with a very delicate touch. Enough to turn the muddy village paths into something that looked almost elegant, at least until someone walked on them and remembered that underneath the beauty, it was still the same old mud, just with better presentation. Children appeared at doorways like flowers blooming, their eyes wide with that particular wonder that comes from waking up in a transformed world. They'd step outside with the reverence of people entering a cathedral, their breath making little clouds that seemed like the most magical thing that had ever happened to exhaled air. Even the adults couldn't help but pause for a moment before diving into the practical concerns that snow would bring. There was something about that first snowfall that demanded acknowledgement, a brief moment of appreciation for winter's artistry before getting on with the business of living through it. The animals responded with their own particular wisdom. Chickens looked absolutely offended, as if someone had played a practical joke on them while they weren't paying attention. Pigs seemed largely unbothered, possibly because they understood that snow was just another form of weather to be endured with the philosophical acceptance that characterized most of their life decisions. Dogs, on the other hand, discovered that snow was possibly the best thing humans had ever invented, even though humans had clearly had nothing to do with it. They bounded through it with the kind of joy usually reserved for discovering unexpected treats. Their enthusiasm, a reminder that even challenging seasons could contain moments of pure delight. The smoke from chimneys rose straighter in the cold air, creating thin gray lines against the white sky, like someone was writing messages between earth and heaven. Everything felt quieter, cleaner, more intentional. This was it. Then, winter had officially moved in. Not aggressively, not threateningly, but with the gentle inevitability of a season that knew it belonged here, that had every right to transform the world into something softer, more patient, more beautiful. The long, gentle wait had begun. And somehow, looking out at this transformed world, that weight didn't seem like such a burden after all. The art of staying warm. Medieval homes were, to put it kindly, exercises in optimism. They believed deeply in the power of positive thinking, strategic blanket placement, and the revolutionary idea that if you gathered enough people and animals in one small space, the collective body heat would eventually triumph over the laws of physics. These weren't the cozy cottages of fairy tales, mind you, but they weren't the miserable hovels of popular imagination either. They were something in between practical shelters built by people who understood that perfect was the enemy of good enough. And good enough was often all you could afford with the materials at hand, and winter approaching faster than your construction skills were improving. The basic structure was what builders optimistically called wattle and daub, essentially mud with confidence. Picture a framework of wooden strips woven together like a very large, very practical basket, then plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and whatever else happened to be available. Cow dung featured prominently in the recipe, not because medieval people enjoyed living in houses made partially of manure, but because cow dung, when mixed with clay and straw, created a surprisingly effective building material. It was waterproof, insulating, and best of all, completely free if you happened to own a cow or knew someone who did. The walls had character, which is a polite way of saying they had cracks. These weren't design flaws so much as features, natural ventilation systems that ensured a constant flow of fresh air, whether you wanted it or not. In summer, this was quite pleasant. In winter, it provided what we might generously call natural air conditioning, keeping the indoor temperature nicely synchronized with whatever was happening outside. Roofs were works of art. If your definition of art included functional pile of dried plant matter arranged with hope and secured with prayer, thatch roofing was like having a living, breathing hat for your house. It expanded and contracted with the weather, provided excellent insulation when it was behaving properly, and offered accommodations to a thriving ecosystem of birds, mice, and insects who appreciated having winter housing as much as the humans below. The charming thing about thatch was its interactive nature. It didn't just sit there being a roof, it participated actively in household life. It shed bits of itself regularly, contributing to the general decor by raining down small pieces of straw at unexpected moments. During storms, it would leak selectively, creating a kind of indoor weather system that kept life interesting and ensured that buckets became essential furniture. Windows were, well, window might be too generous a term. They were more like optimistic holes in the walls, covered with whatever transparent-ish material the family could afford. Oiled parchment was the luxury option, thin animal skin treated with the oil until it became translucent enough to let light through while keeping most of the weather out. Most families made do with cloth or simply left the openings uncovered and used wooden shutters when privacy or protection from the elements became more important than seeing where you were going. The result was homes that existed in a constant state of negotiation with the outdoors. They let in light, air, occasional precipitation, small animals, and the general ambiance of whatever season was currently in charge. Privacy was more of a community agreement than an architectural feature. Everyone pretended not to hear what was happening in their neighbors' homes. And neighbors returned the favor. Floors were straightforward affairs, dirt, sometimes covered with straw or rushes if the family was feeling fancy or had recently had visitors they wanted to impress. These floor coverings served multiple purposes. They provided a bit of cushioning underfoot, absorbed spills and other mishaps, and could be swept out and replaced when they reached the point where even medieval standards of cleanliness were being challenged. The beauty of dirt floors was their complete lack of pretension. They didn't require maintenance so much as acceptance. They were warm in summer, cold in winter, muddy when wet, and dusty when dry. They were, in their way, perfectly honest floors that made no promises they couldn't keep. Doors were substantial pieces of wood that hung on leather hinges and closed with the kind of latches that suggested security while providing what we might charitably call symbolic protection. They kept out casual intruders, most of the weather, and animals that weren't particularly motivated to come inside. For everything else, there was hope and the general understanding that if someone really wanted to get into your house, they probably could, so you might as well be neighborly about it. The interior space was designed around the central fire pit, a practical arrangement that placed the source of heat, light, and cooking in the middle of everything important. This meant that the entire house was essentially one room with the fire as the focal point, like a medieval version of an open-plan design, except instead of being trendy, it was simply the most sensible way to distribute heat to everyone who needed it. Storage was creative, built into walls, hung from rafters, tucked under sleeping areas. Every space served multiple purposes because space itself was precious. A chest might serve as seating during the day, storage always, and extra sleeping space when relatives visited unexpectedly, which in medieval times was most visits since advance notice required either very good timing or supernatural communication skills. These homes weren't trying to impress anyone. They were honest buildings that did their best with what they had, providing shelter that was weatherproof enough, warm enough, and spacious enough for families who understood that comfort was less about luxury and more about having a place where everyone fit. The fire stayed lit, and the roof mostly stayed where it belonged. And somehow, within these humble walls, families created spaces that were unmistakably home places, where children grew up feeling safe, where neighbors gathered for important conversations, where the simple act of being inside when winter raged outside felt like the most natural victory in the world. Fire, the gentle heart of home. If the medieval home was a body, then fire was its heart, the warm beating center around which all life revolved. Not a roaring, dramatic flame, but something steadier, more reliable, like a friend who never left and never asked for much in return except the occasional feeding and attention. Medieval heating was elegantly simple. Start a fire in the middle of the room and let physics handle the rest. The smoke would eventually find its way out through a hole in the roof, though it liked to take the scenic route first, visiting everyone's lungs, coating the walls with a gentle patina, and generally making itself at home before wandering skyward. This wasn't seen as a design flaw, but as part of the natural order of things. Smoke was simply what fire produced. Like conversation was what people produced when they gathered together. You learn to live with it the same way you learn to live with winter itself, not by fighting it, but by accepting it as part of the experience and finding ways to make it work for you. The fire pit occupied the place of honor in the center of the room, surrounded by stones that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back during the long night hours. These stones became the family's heating system, their cooking surface, and their gathering place all at once. Children learned early to respect the fire, not to fear it, but to understand it as both friend and potential danger, like a large, warm dog that occasionally bit. Keeping a fire going was an art form that required patience, attention, and a kind of intuitive understanding of how wood, air, and flame work together. It wasn't simply a matter of throwing log on and hoping for the best. Each type of wood had its own personality. Oak burned long and steady like a reliable friend. Birch caught quickly but burned fast like an enthusiastic but brief conversation. And pine provided dramatic flames but also dramatic amounts of smoke and sparks. Banking a fire for the night was a skill passed down through generations like a family recipe. You carefully arrange the coals, cover them with ash to slow their burning, and add just the right amount of wood to keep them alive until morning without creating so much heat that everyone spent the night sweating under their blankets. Wake up to cold ashes and you'd spend a miserable morning trying to restart everything from scratch using flint and steel and increasingly creative vocabulary. The smoke management system was surprisingly sophisticated in its simplicity. The hole in the roof, called a smoke hole, by people who appreciated straightforward naming conventions, was positioned to take advantage of natural air currents. Hot air rose, carrying the smoke with it, while cooler air entered through gaps around doors and windows, creating a circulation system that worked remarkably well when the wind was cooperative and the atmospheric pressure was feeling agreeable. During storms, when the wind howled and the smoke decided to flow downward instead of up, families learned the art of strategic breathing and the value of sitting as close to the floor as possible, where the air was clearest. These were times for quiet activities, mending, storytelling in low voices, and practicing the medieval virtue of patience. The fire wasn't just about warmth, though warmth was certainly appreciated. It was the social center of the home, the place where families gathered at the end of long days to share meals, stories, and the simple pleasure of being together when the world outside had grown dark and cold. The light it provided was soft and flickering, creating a circle of visibility that made conversation feel intimate and important. Cooking happened directly over or beside the fire, using iron pots suspended on chains or positioned on trivets among the coals. This meant that preparing meals was also part of the fire-tending routine, stirring soup, turning bread, adjusting the position of pots to take advantage of different heat zones. Cooking wasn't something you did separately from heating. It was all part of the same ongoing relationship with flame. The fire required constant small attentions throughout the day. A poke here, a fresh log there, the repositioning of stones or pots. It was like caring for a living thing, which in a way it was. Families developed an intuitive sense of what their fire needed and when: more air, different wood, a moment of being left alone to burn in its own way. Children grew up understanding fire as both essential and deserving of respect. They learned to read its moods, to understand when it was burning cleanly and when it needed help, to add fuel without smothering the flames or creating dangerous situations. By the time they were adults, tending fire had become as natural as breathing. On the best nights, when the fire was burning just right and the smoke was flowing properly upward and the family was gathered close, the medieval home achieved a kind of perfect coziness that no amount of modern technology has quite managed to replicate. The deep satisfaction of warmth earned through careful attention, shared among people who understood that comfort was something you created together, one careful flame at a time. Unexpected roommates, the indoor menagerie. Your medieval home practiced radical inclusivity, not by choice, it's Ali, but by the practical understanding that survival often required creative living arrangements. When winter temperatures dropped below the point where outdoor survival became questionable for anyone without fur, the definition of family expanded to include whoever could contribute body heat and had four legs. This wasn't anthropomorphic sentiment, it was thermal economics. A goat generates warmth. A family of humans generates warmth. Put them together in an enclosed space, and basic physics suggests that everyone benefits from the arrangement. The goat gets shelter from wind and predators. The humans get a living, breathing space heater that occasionally provides milk and has strong opinions about household management. Chickens were the most socially adaptable of the indoor residents. They seemed to understand that winter housing came with certain behavioral expectations. During the day, they'd venture outside to scratch around in whatever patches of ground weren't completely frozen. But as evening approached, they'd line up at the door like polite guests ready for the dinner party to begin. Once inside, chickens demonstrated remarkable facility for finding the warmest spots in the house and claiming them with the confidence of seasoned travelers who knew good accommodations when they saw them. They'd settle near the fire pit, not close enough to become dinner accidentally, but positioned to take maximum advantage of the heat while maintaining their dignity and their feathers. The evening routine became a kind of gentle chaos that families learned to navigate with good humor. Chickens would stake out their preferred roosting spots, usually somewhere elevated and near, but not too near the fire. Children would be tasked with checking that all the birds had made it inside safely, creating a nightly head count that combined responsibility with the kind of logic puzzles that came from chickens' habit of hiding in unexpected places. Pigs, when families were fortunate enough to have them, brought their own particular charm to indoor living. They were remarkably clean house guests, contrary to popular prejudice, and generated impressive amounts of heat. A pig in winter residence was like having a large, occasionally vocal radiator that sometimes expressed opinions about the evening meal preparation. The intelligence of pigs made them interesting companions during the long winter evenings. They seemed to understand household routines and would position themselves strategically for maximum comfort while staying out of the way of human activities. Children often develop strong friendships with winter resident pigs, relationships that were carefully not discussed when spring arrived and outdoor living resumed. Goats approached indoor living with a kind of confidence that suggested they had been waiting all their lives for humans to come to their senses about proper housing arrangements. They had opinions about everything: the quality of bedding, the timing of meals, the appropriateness of various family members' behavior, and they expressed these opinions through a sophisticated system of facial expressions and strategically timed vocalizations. The practical benefits of animal cohabitation extended beyond warmth. Fresh eggs appeared regularly. Regardless of weather, milk continued to be available for families with dairy animals. And the constant presence of creatures who needed care provided structure to winter days that might otherwise have stretched endlessly. But perhaps the most valuable contribution these animal roommates made was companionship. Winter could be isolating, even within families. The presence of creatures who were simply peacefully alive, breathing, moving, occasionally making gentle noises added a layer of comfort that went beyond the physical warmth they provided. Children especially benefited from these relationships. Having animals to care for gave them responsibilities that mattered, ways to contribute meaningfully to family survival. They learned animal behavior, developed empathy, and gained the confidence that comes from being trusted with important tasks. The arrangement wasn't without its challenges. Of course, animals have their own schedules, their own needs, and their own ideas about appropriate indoor behavior. Families developed elaborate systems of gates, barriers, and designated areas to maintain some semblance of organization. Housekeeping took on new dimensions when your household included creatures who couldn't be expected to understand human concepts of cleanliness. But somehow it worked. Families adapted, animals adapted, and together they created households that were warmer, livelier, and oddly more peaceful than either species might have managed alone. The gentle presence of breathing, living creatures made the long winter nights feel less lonely, less empty, and more like what homes were supposed to be, places where life continued, quietly and steadily, until spring returned and outdoor adventures could resume. The daily rhythm, the gentle art of winter living, soft arrival. Dawn in a medieval winter wasn't an alarm clock. It was more like a gentle suggestion that perhaps, maybe, if you felt like it, you might consider starting the day. Winter mornings arrived quietly, without drama or urgency, wrapped in the kind of soft gray light that made the world look like it was still half asleep and perfectly content to stay that way. You'd wake gradually, not to the harsh jolt of modern schedules, but to the slow realization that the darkness outside had shifted from the deep black of night to the softer gray of early morning. There was no rush, no sudden scramble for consciousness. Time moved differently in winter, more like honey than water, thick and golden and unhurried. The first order of business was always the fire, and approaching it felt like visiting an old friend who might or might not be feeling sociable. You'd pad softly across the dirt floor, careful not to disturb family members or animals who were still enjoying the luxury of sleep, and crouch beside the stone fire pit to see what the night had left you. If you were fortunate, there would still be glowing embers buried beneath the ash, tiny orange eyes winking at you like friendly spirits who had kept watch while you slept. This was cause for quiet celebration, the kind of small victory that made the difference between a good morning and a challenging one. You gently blow on these embers, feeding them bits of dry kindling, coaxing them back to life with the patience of someone who understood that fire, like friendship, couldn't be rushed. If the fire had died completely during the night, well, that was simply another kind of morning one that began with the meditative ritual of flint and steel, the careful arrangement of tinder, and the particular satisfaction that came from creating flame from seemingly nothing. These mornings taught patience and reminded you not to take warmth for granted. Once the fire was crackling cheerfully, sending its gentle smoke toward the roof hole and beginning to chase the night's chill from the room, you could attend to the small ceremony of morning water. The bucket beside the door would often wear a thin skin of ice, which you'd break with whatever implement was handy, usually a wooden ladle that had been designated for this purpose and worn smooth by years of ice-breaking service. This wasn't the harsh shock of winter camping, but something gentler. The ice was thin, more like nature's way of saying good morning than any serious attempt at making life difficult. You dipped the ladle through the broken surface, bringing up water that was cold but not unbearably so, perfect for washing faces and hands that had grown accustomed to winter's temperature variations. The animals would stir as the fire began to warm the space, stretching and making the small sounds that indicated everyone was gradually returning to consciousness. Chickens would ruffle their feathers and make quiet conversational noises, as if discussing the night's dreams or planning the day's activities. The goat might offer a soft bleat that could be interpreted as either good morning or where's breakfast? Probably both. Children woke like flowers opening to sunlight, gradually and sweetly. They'd emerge from beneath piles of wool blankets, looking like small, tousled creatures who had spent the night burrowing into warmth. Their first instinct was always to seek the fire, drawn to its light and heat like moths, but friendlier moths who understood the value of patience and sharing space. The morning routine unfolded with the kind of gentle choreography that families develop over time. Someone would attend to the animal's immediate needs: fresh water, a bit of grain or hay, the opening of doors so outdoor ventures could be contemplated by those brave enough to consider them. Someone else would begin the slow process of breakfast preparation, which in winter usually meant building on yesterday's dinner rather than starting fresh. Pottage, that eternal medieval stew, would be stirred back to life, perhaps with a bit of fresh water to thin it, maybe some additional grains or vegetables if the family stores were holding up well. The pot would be positioned over the fire with the care usually reserved for precious objects, which it essentially was the source of warmth, nutrition, and the comforting routine that anchored each day. There was no rushing toward productivity, no anxious checking of schedules or urgent tasks. Morning was for gentle awakening, for easing into consciousness, for letting body and mind adjust to the idea of being awake and active. Children might help with small tasks, feeding chickens, gathering eggs if any had appeared overnight, bringing in firewood from the pile just outside the door. Adults moved with the measured pace of people who understood that energy was precious and shouldn't be wasted on unnecessary haste. Every movement had purpose, but that purpose was tempered with patience. Winter had taught them that most things could wait a few extra minutes, and those few extra minutes often made the difference between a task done frantically and a task done well. As the morning light strengthened and the fire settled into its steady rhythm, the day would begin in earnest, but it began gently, with respect for the body's need to transition from sleep to wakefulness, for the soul's need to greet each new day as a gift rather than a burden. This was morning as meditation, as gentle preparation for whatever the day might bring. The sacred art of daily work in medieval winter wasn't about productivity metrics or efficiency optimization. It was about the gentle rhythm of staying alive, one careful task at a time. There was something almost meditative about the way days unfolded, each activity flowing naturally into the next, like notes in a very long, very practical song. The division of labor wasn't based on rigid gender roles so much as practical specialization, with everyone contributing to the family's survival in ways that matched their skills, physical capabilities, and the immediate needs of the household. It was teamwork born of necessity, but teamwork nonetheless, where everyone's contribution mattered and everyone understood their part in the larger symphony of winter survival. For the men, much of the day revolved around the ongoing relationship with firewood, that most essential of winter resources. This wasn't the weekend hobby of modern fireplace owners, but a full-time occupation that required the kind of dedication usually reserved for religious vocations. Every day brought the need for more wood, and every piece of wood represented a small victory against the cold. The process began with assessment, checking the family's current supply, evaluating what needed to be used immediately versus what could be saved for later, and making the daily calculation of how much new wood would need to be gathered. This wasn't guesswork, but educated estimation based on weather conditions, the efficiency of the current fire, and the family's heating needs. Gathering wood was part scavenger hunt, part physical exercise, and part forest communion. Men would venture into the woods with axes that had been in families for generations, tools that had developed their own personalities through years of use. These axes weren't just implements, but partners in the daily work of survival, requiring their own care and maintenance to remain effective. The woods in winter had their own particular beauty and challenges. Trees that had seemed friendly in summer took on different characteristics when covered in snow and ice. Deadfall that would be perfect for burning might be buried under drifts or frozen to the ground. Live trees suitable for cutting required careful evaluation. Too green, and they'd smoke without providing much heat. Too dry, and they might be harboring insects or rot. But there was something deeply satisfying about this work. The rhythm of chopping, the physical engagement with tools and materials, the immediate feedback of wood splitting, cleanly or stubbornly refusing to cooperate. It was work that engaged both body and mind, requiring strength but also strategy, persistence but also patience. Meanwhile, the women's domain encompassed what might generously be called everything else. But this everything else was the intricate network of tasks that transformed a house into a home and raw materials into the necessities of life. Spinning occupied much of the winter day, not the romantic spinning of fairy tales, but the practical, meditative work of turning fleece into thread that would become cloth, that would become clothing that might mean the difference between warmth and cold. The spinning wheel became a kind of meditation device, its gentle rhythm providing a soundtrack for conversation, storytelling, and quiet contemplation. Women would gather in the warmest part of the house, their wheels creating a soft, rhythmic humming that blended with the crackle of the fire and the occasional commentary from resident animals. This was multitasking in its most elegant form, hands busy with wool, while minds engaged in the social fabric of community life. Stories were shared, problems discussed, children taught, and wisdom passed down through the generations, all while the practical work of creating clothing continued steadily. Mending was another art form that winter demanded. Every piece of clothing, every blanket, every useful textile was precious and deserving of repair rather than replacement. Women developed an almost mystical ability to extend the life of fabric through creative patching, darning, and reconstruction. A torn cloak might be transformed through careful needlework into something that was not only functional, but actually more interesting than its original incarnation. Cooking, of course, was an ongoing project rather than a series of discrete meals. The eternal pot of pottage required constant attention, stirring to prevent burning, seasoning to improve flavor, additions to extend its life and nutritional value. This wasn't gourmet cuisine, but something more fundamental, the transformation of available ingredients into sustenance that would keep bodies functioning and spirits relatively cheerful. Children's work was carefully calibrated to their abilities and attention spans, but it was real work with real consequences. Small hands were perfect for tasks that required patience and dexterity, sorting grains, winding yarn, feeding chickens, and gathering eggs. Children learned early that their contributions mattered, that the family's survival depended on everyone doing their part. But perhaps more importantly, children learned skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Boys began learning the mysteries of wood selection, fire management, and tool maintenance. Girls absorbed the complex knowledge of textile production, food preparation, and household management, not because the future was predetermined, but because these skills were essential for anyone who wanted to live successfully in a world that demanded practical competence. The beauty of this daily rhythm was its integration. Work wasn't something separate from life, it was life, woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily existence. Conversation happened while hands were busy, relationships were maintained while tasks were completed, and the satisfaction of useful work provided its own form of entertainment and fulfillment. There were no weekends, no clear division between work time and leisure time, because survival was a full-time occupation. But this didn't feel oppressive because the work had meaning, immediate purpose, and visible results. You could see the pile of firewood growing, feel the warmth from the well-tended fire, wear the clothes that had been mended with care. As afternoon faded toward evening, the pace would gradually slow. Tasks were completed with the satisfaction of work well done. Tools were cleaned and stored for tomorrow's use, and the family would gather closer to the fire for the evening's more social activities. Work in medieval winter was hard, certainly, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that modern life sometimes struggles to provide the satisfaction of essential tasks completed well, of useful skills employed for important purposes, of working together toward goals that truly mattered. Evening's gentle embrace, evenings in medieval winter arrived not as an ending, but as a transformation. The gentle shift from the day's practical activities to the night's more contemplative pleasures. As the short winter day began to fade, families would draw closer to their fires like flowers turning toward the sun, creating circles of warmth and light that felt like small sanctuaries against the vast darkness outside. The transition happened gradually, marked not by clocks, but by the changing quality of light filtering through the small windows, and the way shadows began to stretch longer across the dirt floor. There was something almost ceremonial about this daily gathering, as if families were performing an ancient ritual of coming together, sharing warmth, and acknowledging that they had successfully navigated another day. Dinner preparation became a communal activity, with everyone contributing according to their abilities. Children might be tasked with stirring the eternal pot of pottage, while adults added whatever improvements the day's activities had made possible, perhaps some preserved vegetables from the family stores. Maybe an egg if the chickens had been feeling generous. Occasionally a bit of salted meat if this was a special evening, or if someone had been particularly successful in their daily endeavors. The meal itself was simple but satisfying in ways that went beyond mere nutrition. Eating together by firelight, sharing food that had been prepared with care from ingredients that represented the family's careful planning and hard work, created a sense of accomplishment and gratitude that seasoned the simple fare better than any herb. Conversation flowed naturally around the fire, but it was a different kind of talk than the practical discussions that accompanied daytime work. Evening conversation was for stories, for sharing observations about the day, for gentle speculation about tomorrow's weather or the progress of winter. Children would contribute their own perspectives on the day's events, often with the kind of insights that reminded adults that wisdom sometimes came in small packages. The animals, now settled into their evening routines, provided their own gentle soundtrack to these family gatherings. Chickens would make swats and conversational sounds as they arranged themselves for the night. The goat might offer occasional commentary on the proceedings. Even the mice in the walls seemed to understand that evening was for quiet activities, reducing their scurrying to a barely audible whisper. Handwork continued by firelight, but at a more relaxed pace. Women might work on mending or spinning, but with less urgency than during the day's productive hours. Men might sharpen tools or make small repairs to household items. These activities provided a gentle focus for hands and minds while leaving room for conversation and companionship. Sometimes, if the evening was particularly peaceful and the fire was burning well, someone might share a story. These weren't necessarily elaborate tales, but simple narratives, memories of past winters, accounts of neighbors' amusing mishaps, gentle folklore that had been passed down through generations. The telling was as important as the tale itself, a way of weaving the family's experiences into the larger tapestry of human experience. Children often fell asleep during these evening gatherings, curled up near the fire like contented cats. Parents would let them sleep where they lay for a while, understanding that the warmth and security of the family circle was the most natural sleeping aid available. Eventually, they'd be gently moved to their designated sleeping areas. But there was no rush, no strict bedtime schedule to enforce. Music, when it happened, was simple and spontaneous. Someone might hum a familiar tune while working, or a child might sing a song learned from grandmother. There were no performances, no audience, just a natural expression of contentment that sometimes emerged when people felt safe and warm and together. As the fire began to settle into its nighttime rhythm and the family prepared for sleep, there was a sense of completion that modern evenings sometimes lack. The day had been lived fully, work had been accomplished, relationships had been nurtured, and everyone had contributed to the family's survival and well-being. The transition to sleep was as gradual as everything else in medieval time. People would bank the fire for the night, arrange themselves under their wool blankets, and settle into the kind of rest that came from physical tiredness, earned through useful work and the deep satisfaction of another day successfully navigated. Outside, winter continued its patient work, but inside, surrounded by family, animals, and the gentle warmth of a well-tended fire, sleep came easily and naturally, bringing dreams of spring and the quiet confidence that tomorrow would bring its own gentle rhythms and satisfactions. Food, the art of making little into enough pottage. The eternal meditation. Pottage wasn't just a meal, it was a philosophy, a way of life, and quite possibly the medieval world's greatest contribution to the art of culinary optimism. Take whatever you have, add water, apply heat, and trust that somehow, through the gentle alchemy of time and hope, Something nourishing would emerge from the pot. It was like cooking roulette, but with more turnips and fewer winning combinations. Yet families approached this daily gamble with the kind of cheerful determination that suggested they understood something profound about the relationship between low expectations and pleasant surprises. The pot itself was often the most valuable item in the household, after the roof a large, iron vessel that had quite possibly been in the family longer than anyone could remember. It hung over the fire on a sturdy chain, close enough to the flames to maintain a gentle simmer, but not so close as to scorch the bottom and create what medieval cooks diplomatically referred to as extra flavor complexity. The beauty of pottage lay in its infinite adaptability. It was never the same meal twice, because it was never really finished. Today's dinner became tomorrow's base, which became next week's foundation for whatever ingredients had become available in the meantime. It was less a recipe than an ongoing conversation between the cook and whatever the family happened to possess at any given moment. The process began each morning with an assessment of possibilities. What remained from yesterday? What could be added today? How much water would be needed to transform the existing ingredients into something that could reasonably be called soup for another 24 hours? These weren't calculations, but intuitive decisions born from years of experience with the particular temperament of the family pot. Grains formed the foundation: barley, oats, sometimes rye if the family had been particularly blessed by harvest or trade. These would be added with the solemnity of someone making an investment, because in winter, every grain represented future calories that might mean the difference between feeling satisfied and feeling merely less hungry than before. Vegetables joined the pot according to availability and season. Root vegetables were treasured contributors: turnips, parsnips, onions when they could be found or afforded. These hardy souls had spent months in root cellars contemplating their destiny and were ready to fulfill their purpose as contributors to the great pot of survival. Cabbage, when available, brought its own particular personality to the proceedings. Medieval cooks understood that cabbage was best appreciated in small doses and long cooking times, where its more assertive characteristics could mellow into something approaching friendliness. Pickled cabbage was especially valued, not just for its keeping qualities, but for its ability to add what we might now call umami to the pot, that indefinable something that made simple ingredients taste more complex and satisfying. Herbs were the pot's jewelry, small additions that transformed the ordinary into something approaching the memorable. Thyme, sage, and parsley when they could be grown or foraged. Salt when it could be afforded or traded for. These weren't just seasonings, but small miracles that reminded families that food could be more than mere sustenance. It could approach pleasure. The stirring of pottage became a kind of meditation, a repetitive task that allowed the mind to wander while the hands remained usefully occupied. Children learned early to stir with respect, understanding that the pot required attention but not anxiety. Too much stirring could break down the ingredients into mush. Too little could result in burning. Like many medieval skills, it required balance, patience, and the kind of intuitive understanding that came from daily practice. Meat, when it graced the point, was treated with the reverence usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. A bit of preserved pork, a chicken that had reached the end of its egg-laying career, occasionally a piece of beef from an animal that had served the family well in life and continued to serve them in death. These additions weren't just protein, but special occasions that transformed ordinary meals into celebrations. The timing of pottage was beautifully simple. It was ready when it was ready, and it was ready whenever the family needed it to be ready. There were no precise cooking times, no complex temperature controls. The pot simmered gently throughout the day, its contents slowly melding into something greater than the sum of its parts. Serving pottage was an art of portion control disguised as generous hospitality. Everyone received a bowlful, but the size of that bowl and the density of its contents depended on complex calculations involving family size, food stores, and optimistic projections about how long winter might last. Children learned early to eat slowly, to savor each spoonful, not just for politeness, but because there might not be seconds, and there almost certainly wouldn't be thirds. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about pottage was how it managed to be satisfying despite its simplicity. There was something about the slow cooking, the melding of flavors, the warmth that spread through cold bodies, that transformed simple ingredients into genuine comfort. It wasn't gourmet cuisine, but it was something more valuable food that nourished both body and spirit, that created the foundation for family gatherings, and that somehow managed to taste like home regardless of what random ingredients had gone into its creation. Bread, the daily miracle. Medieval bread was an exercise in optimism disguised as daily sustenance, made from whatever grain was available, occasionally padded with creative additions like ground acorns, sawdust, or various things that were technically edible if you approached them with the right attitude. Bread represented humanity's triumph over the basic limitations of available ingredients. Think of it as an early form of whole grain nutrition, except instead of being trendy, it was simply what happened when you ground up whatever seeds or grains you could find and convinced them to hold together long enough to be called bread. The result was food that was part sustenance, part building material, and part lesson in the virtue of strong teeth. Flour was a relative term in medieval kitchens. What we now call flour was often what medieval bakers optimistically called the best we can do with what we have. Wheat flour was a luxury reserved for special occasions or families blessed with particularly good harvests. Most bread was made from rye, barley, oats, or combinations thereof, creating loaves that were dark, dense, and possessed of strong character. The grinding process added its own personality to the final product. Grain was ground by hand using quernstones, two heavy stones that were rubbed together with the grain between them. This was work that required patience, upper body strength, and the ability to appreciate the meditative qualities of repetitive motion. Children often helped with this task, learning early that bread didn't simply appear, but was the result of considerable effort and planning. Sometimes the flour was supplemented with ingredients that stretched the grain supply while adding their own nutritional contributions. Ground acorns, when properly prepared to remove their natural bitterness, added substance and a nutty flavor that some families actually came to prefer. Dried peas or beans could be ground and mixed in, creating bread that was higher in protein and more filling. The bread-making process was a weekly ritual that involved the entire household. Mixing the dough required strong arms and patient kneading, working the mixture until it achieved the proper consistency. This wasn't the light, airy dough of modern bread, but something denser, more substantial, designed to provide maximum nutrition and staying power. Baking often happened in communal ovens, shared among several families or used on designated days when the oven would be heated for multiple batches. The process of heating a medieval oven was itself a small production. Fire was built inside the oven chamber until the stones were thoroughly heated. Then the coals were removed and the bread inserted into the residual heat. Timing was crucial, and families developed sophisticated systems for determining when the oven was at the perfect temperature for their particular type of bread. The resulting loaves were works of practical art, dark, crusty, and substantial enough to serve as both food and building material if the need arose. They were designed to last, with crust that protected the interior from moisture and decay. A well-made loaf could remain edible for days or even weeks, gradually hardening but still providing nutrition when soaked in soup or ale. Eating medieval bread required strategy. Fresh bread was a pleasure, but as it aged, it required increasingly creative approaches. Stale bread was soaked in ale, wine, or broth to restore it to edibility. Really old bread was ground up and used as thickening for soups or stews. Nothing was wasted because waste was a luxury that winter didn't allow. The daily bread became more than just food, it was security, comfort, and proof that the family was managing their resources well enough to maintain this most basic necessity. Breaking bread together is literally that sharing hard-won sustenance that represented the successful transformation of raw grain into something that could sustain life through another day of medieval winter. There was something deeply satisfying about bread made from ingredients you had grown, harvested, ground, and baked yourself. It might have been dense enough to serve as a doorstop, but it was your doorstop, made with your hands from your grain, and it tasted like accomplishment seasoned with just a hint of justified pride. The art of preservation. Medieval food security. Medieval families approached food preservation with the focused intensity of people who understood that winter was essentially a very long camping trip with no option to run to the store if supplies ran low. Every technique, every method, every creative solution was part of an elaborate strategy to convince food to remain edible long past its natural inclinations. Salt was the crown jewel of preservation methods, valued like the precious commodity it truly was. Families would acquire salt through trade, careful budgeting, or occasionally as payment for services rendered, and then use it with the precision of pharmacists measuring medicine. Too little salt and preservation failed, resulting in spoiled food and disappointed families. Too much salt and the food became so briny that eating it required the kind of determination usually reserved for completing unpleasant but necessary tasks. The salting process was a family affair that transformed kitchens into temporary food processing centers. Large cuts of meat would be carefully rubbed with salt, ensuring every surface received proper coverage. Then came the waiting days or weeks of patient curing while the salt drew out moisture and created an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't thrive. Children learned to recognize the signs of proper curing, understanding that their family's winter protein supply depended on getting this process exactly right. Smoking added another layer of preservation while contributing flavors that transformed simple preserved meats into something approaching delicacy. Families built small smokehouses or designated areas where meat could hang in carefully controlled smoke for days at a time. The process required constant attention, maintaining the right kind of fire, ensuring proper air circulation, adjusting for weather conditions that might affect the smoking process. Different woods contributed different flavors and preservation qualities. Applewood created gentle, sweet smoke that was particularly prized for preserving pork. Oak provided strong, long-lasting smoke that could penetrate large cuts of meat. Families developed their own preferences and techniques, passed down through generations like precious family recipes. Drying was perhaps the most democratic preservation method, requiring no expensive ingredients or complex equipment, just time, patience, and cooperation from the weather. Vegetables, fruits, herbs, and fish could all be preserved through careful drying, which concentrated flavors while removing the moisture that allowed spoilage. Families would string up herbs, slice vegetables into thin pieces for air drying, and create elaborate hanging systems that turned homes into temporary food dehydration centers. Children became experts at recognizing when foods were properly dried, learning to distinguish between food that was ready for storage and food that needed more time to reach preservation. Readiness. Fermentation was the most mysterious and magical of preservation methods, requiring families to trust in processes they didn't fully understand, but had learned to manage through generations of experience. Cabbage became sauerkraut through careful salting and fermentation, creating food that was not only preserved, but actually more nutritious than its fresh predecessor. Dairy products underwent their own transformations. Milk became cheese through processes that seemed almost alchemical. Families learned to manage the complex timing and conditions required for successful cheesemaking, understanding that success meant months of preserved protein, while failure meant the loss of precious milk with nothing to show for it. Root vegetables presented their own preservation challenges and opportunities. Root cellars became carefully managed environments where turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions could survive winter in a state of suspended animation, not growing, but not spoiling either. Families learned to check these stores regularly, removing any vegetables that showed signs of decay before they could contaminate their neighbors. Perhaps most importantly, medieval families learned to use every part of every preserved food. Bones from preserved meats became soup bases. Whey from cheese making was used for bread making or feeding animals. Even the salt used for preservation was carefully recovered and reused when possible. The result was a food system where nothing was wasted. Everything had multiple potential uses, and families developed deep appreciation for the complex work required to transform seasonal abundance into year-round sustenance. Preservation wasn't just about keeping food edible, it was about maintaining hope, security, and the promise that winter would eventually end and fresh food would be available again. When stores grew thin, the philosophy of enough. When food supplies began to dwindle, medieval families discovered they were participating in an advanced course in creative mathematics, the kind where you learn to divide very little among many people and somehow make it feel like a reasonable amount. This wasn't just about rationing, it was about the transformation of scarcity into a form of abundance through the alchemy of gratitude, creativity, and shared determination. The first sign that winter stores were running lower than hoped wasn't dramatic shortage, but subtle adjustments. Portions became slightly smaller, but served with the same ceremony as larger portions had been. Soup was extended with a bit more water. Bread recipes were stretched with whatever could reasonably be added without completely abandoning the pretense that the result was still bread. Families became experts in what we might now call mindful eating, though they simply called it making do. Meals were eaten slowly, with attention to each bite, not from any sophisticated understanding of nutrition or digestion, but from the practical knowledge that eating slowly made smaller portions feel more satisfying and ensured that everyone had time to appreciate what was available. Children learned creative approaches to feeling full without consuming large quantities of food. Warm drinks, herbal teas made from whatever could be foraged or preserved, help fill stomachs while providing comfort and the illusion of abundance. Hot water with a bit of honey, when honey was available, became a treat that could make a sparse meal feel more complete. The evening pottage pot became an exercise in culinary philosophy. What constituted enough for each person? How could the available ingredients be distributed to ensure everyone received adequate nutrition while making the supplies last as long as possible? These weren't just practical decisions, but moral ones, requiring families to balance individual needs against collective survival. Community sharing became more important during leaner times, not through formal charity, but through the quiet understanding that survival was a collaborative effort. Neighbors might share different types of preserved foods, creating variety in diets that had grown monotonous. A family with extra preserved fish might trade with neighbors who had more stored grains, creating meals that were more nutritious and interesting than either family could have achieved alone. Foraging took on new importance as winter stores dwindled. Families sent their most knowledgeable members to search for winter foods that could supplement their supplies, nuts that might have been overlooked during autumn gathering, hardy greens that survived under snow, bark from certain trees that could be ground and added to bread recipes for additional nutrition. But perhaps most remarkably, these times of scarcity often brought out the best in family relationships. Shared hardship created bonds of mutual support and understanding. Children learned early that complaining about food was pointless and unkind, while adults modeled patience and creativity in the face of challenging circumstances. The families who navigated food shortages successfully understood that survival wasn't just about having enough calories, it was about maintaining morale, hope, and family cohesion during times when those qualities were tested daily. They learned that enough wasn't a fixed quantity, but a flexible concept that could expand and contract based on attitude, creativity, and the fundamental understanding that winter would eventually end, spring would return, and abundance would be possible again. Health and healing. When the body asked for rest, falling ill in medieval times was like your body deciding to take an unscheduled vacation, not necessarily pleasant, But everyone understood that sometimes you just had to surrender to the process and let the village's particular brand of optimistic medicine work its gentle magic while you concentrated on the important business of getting better. Unlike modern illness, which often feels like an interruption to be conquered quickly and efficiently, medieval sickness was understood as something more natural, a temporary condition that required patience, rest, and the kind of community care that transformed individual suffering into shared concern. When someone in the family began showing signs of illness, the response wasn't panic, but a quiet mobilization of resources and knowledge that had been passed down through generations. The first symptoms were usually familiar ones, a persistent cough that sounded different from the everyday winter coughs everyone carried, a tiredness that didn't improve with rest, or that particular feeling of being cold from the inside out that suggested the body was fighting something more serious than daily winter challenges. Families recognized these signs with the practiced eye of people who understood that early attention could often prevent more serious developments. The initial response was beautifully simple: create the conditions that would allow the body to heal itself. This meant ensuring the sick person stayed warm, well hydrated, and as comfortable as possible given the limitations of medieval housing. The area near the fire became a kind of informal recovery room where the ill could benefit from both warmth and the gentle company of family members going about their daily activities. Rest wasn't seen as laziness, but as medicine itself. Medieval people understood intuitively what modern medicine has rediscovered, that sleep and rest are essential components of healing. The sick person was relieved of their usual responsibilities without guilt or concern, because everyone understood that recovery required energy that couldn't be spent on daily tasks. Hydration became a gentle ritual of care. Water was boiled not just for safety, but because warm liquids were understood to be soothing and healing. Family members would ensure a steady supply of warm drinks, herbal teas, when appropriate, herbs were available, warm water with honey when honey could be spared, or simply warm water that provided comfort and the reassurance of constant attention. The family's response to illness revealed the depth of medieval understanding about the connection between physical and emotional healing. The sick person wasn't isolated, but remained part of the family circle, able to participate in conversations and daily life as energy allowed. Children were encouraged to spend quiet time near sick family members, not just to provide comfort, but to learn about caring for others during vulnerable times. Appetite changes were accommodated with patience and creativity. If the usual pottage seemed too heavy or unappetizing, families would prepare simpler alternatives, thin broths made from whatever was available, bread soaked in warm milk, if milk was available, or other easily digestible foods that could provide nutrition without taxing a system that was already working hard to heal. The rhythm of care was gentle and unhurried. Family members would check on the sick person regularly, but without the anxious hovering that could make recovery feel like a performance. There was an understanding that healing happened on its own timeline and couldn't be rushed through worry or constant attention. Sleep became sacred during illness, protected by family members who would ensure the fire stayed fed, animals remained quiet, and household activities continued at reduced volume. Medieval families understood that good sleep was often the most powerful medicine available, and they created conditions that supported the deep, restorative rest that illness demanded. The sick person's comfort was attended to with whatever resources were available. Extra blankets, the warmest spot near the fire, the most comfortable place to rest. These weren't luxuries, but essential elements of treatment. Families understood that physical comfort supported the body's healing processes and was worth whatever small sacrifices it required. Perhaps most importantly, illness was never faced alone, even when the sick person felt too weak to participate fully in family life. They remained surrounded by the gentle presence of people who cared about their recovery. This wasn't just emotional support, but practical medicine. The understanding that healing happened more effectively in an atmosphere of love, hope, and patient attention. Recovery was expected, not as an act of willpower or medical intervention, but as the natural result of providing the body with what it needed to heal itself. This quiet confidence in the body's ability to recover, combined with practical care and emotional support, created an environment where healing could happen gently and naturally. The village healer's garden, herbal wisdom and gentle care. Every medieval village was blessed with at least one person who possessed what we might call the knowing, an intuitive understanding of which plants could soothe, which herbs could heal, and which combinations of natural remedies could help guide the body back to health. These healers weren't mysterious figures practicing arcane arts, but practical people who had learned through observation, experience, and the accumulated wisdom of generations how to work with nature's pharmacy. The village healer's knowledge was like a living library, stored not in books, but in memory, passed down through careful teaching and apprenticeship. They understood which herbs grew locally, when to harvest them for maximum potency, and how to prepare them for various ailments. This wasn't guesswork, but sophisticated botanical knowledge that had been refined through centuries of careful observation and practical application. Willow bark was treasured for its ability to reduce fever and ease pain, the medieval equivalent of aspirin, though of course they didn't understand the chemistry behind its effectiveness. They simply knew that tea made from willow bark could bring relief to those suffering from headaches, fever, or general aches and pains. The preparation was simple but required attention. Bark was carefully harvested, dried, and then steeped in hot water until it released its healing properties. Chamomile was the gentle soother, prized for its ability to calm upset stomachs, ease anxiety, and promote restful sleep. Medieval families would cultivate small plots of chamomile near their homes, understanding that this unassuming flower was worth its weight in comfort. The tea was mild enough for children, but effective enough for adults, making it a versatile remedy for various complaints that responded well to gentle treatment. Elderflower and elderberry were considered among nature's most generous medicines. The flowers made delicate teas that could ease respiratory complaints, while the berries were preserved into syrups that provided both nutrition and medicine during winter months. Elder trees were often found growing near village areas, as if they understood their role in supporting human health and wanted to remain accessible. Thyme was valued not just as a cooking herb, but as a powerful respiratory remedy. Its strong antimicrobial properties made it useful for treating coughs, chest congestion, and throat irritation. Healers would prepare thyme steam treatments, encouraging patients to breathe the vapors from hot thyme preparations, providing relief through both the medicinal properties of the herb and the soothing effects of warm, moist air. Nettle, despite its stinging reputation in fresh form, was considered a powerful spring tonic and blood purifier. When properly prepared through drying or cooking, nettles lost their sting but retained their nutritional and medicinal value. Nettle tea was particularly valued during late winter and early spring when bodies needed help recovering from months of limited fresh foods. The preparation of herbal remedies was as important as the selection of proper herbs. Healers understood that different preparation methods, teas, poultices, tinctures, or simple applications could enhance or diminish the effectiveness of natural medicines. They knew how long to steep teas for optimal benefit, how to combine herbs for synergistic effects, and how to adjust preparations for different ages and conditions. Honey, when available, was considered almost magical in its healing properties. It was used not just as a sweetener for herbal teas, but as a medicine in its own right. Healers understood that honey could soothe throat irritation, provide energy for recovering patients, and even help preserve other medicinal preparations. The combination of honey with various herbs created remedies that were both effective and pleasant to take. The healing process involved more than just administering herbs, it encompassed the entire environment of care. Healers understood that recovery happened more effectively in calm, supportive atmospheres. They would often spend time with patients, not just providing medicines, but offering reassurance, guidance, and the kind of presence that conveyed confidence in the body's ability to heal. Family involvement was crucial to successful treatment. Healers would teach family members how to prepare and administer remedies, how to recognize signs of improvement or concern, and how to create the conditions that supported healing. This wasn't just practical instruction, but education in the art of caring for others during vulnerable times. The healer's approach to illness was holistic in the truest sense. They understood that physical symptoms were often connected to emotional, spiritual, or social factors. Treatment might include recommendations for rest, dietary changes, spiritual practices, or changes in daily routines that could support the body's natural healing processes. Perhaps most importantly, village healers possessed the wisdom to understand the limits of their knowledge and abilities. They knew when conditions were beyond what herbal medicine could address, when symptoms suggested problems that required different approaches, and when the most important medicine they could provide was simply comfort and presence during times when healing wasn't possible. The relationship between healer and patient was built on trust, respect, and the shared understanding that healing was a collaborative process between human knowledge, natural medicine, and the body's own remarkable ability to restore itself to health when given proper support and care. The quiet journey back to health. Recovery in medieval times was like watching spring arrive gradual, gentle, and marked by small daily improvements that accumulated into something that eventually felt like wellness returning. There were no dramatic medical interventions, no sudden transformations from sick to healthy, just a patient process of allowing the body to remember how to be well. The first signs of improvement were often so subtle they might be missed by someone looking for dramatic change. A cough that sounded slightly less harsh in the morning, a fever that broke during the night, leaving the patient damp but cooler, or simply the return of interest in food after days of having no appetite at all. Family members learned to recognize these gentle indicators, understanding that recovery was happening even when progress seemed almost imperceptibly slow. Appetite was often the most reliable indicator of returning health. When someone who had been subsisting on thin broths and herbal teas suddenly showed interest in the family's regular pottage, it was cause for quiet celebration. The body was announcing its readiness to return to normal function, and families responded by gradually increasing both the quantity and complexity of foods offered to the recovering person. Strength returned in measured increments. First, the ability to sit up comfortably for longer periods. Then, perhaps, walking a few steps around the house without feeling exhausted. Eventually, the gradual resumption of light household tasks as energy permitted. This wasn't about pushing toward full activity, but about allowing the body to dictate the pace of its own recovery. Sleep patterns provided another window into the healing process. The deep, heavy sleep of serious illness would gradually give way to more normal rest patterns. Patients would begin waking more naturally, feeling refreshed rather than depleted, and showing interest in the daily activities happening around them rather than simply observing from a distance. The family's role during recovery was crucial, but required delicate balance. Too much attention could make the recovering person feel like an invalid, while too little could suggest that their continued weakness wasn't being taken seriously. Successful families learned to supportive presence without creating pressure to recover faster than the body was ready to heal. Work resumed gradually and voluntarily. The recovering person might begin with the smallest tasks, perhaps helping to stir the pot or sort dried beans, not because their labor was desperately needed, but because useful work was part of feeling normal again. These small contributions were accepted gratefully, providing both physical activity and psychological benefit. Community recognition of recovery was similarly gentle. Neighbors didn't expect immediate return to full activity, but acknowledged improvement with encouraging words and patient understanding. The village healer might check in periodically, not to provide additional treatment, but to confirm that recovery was progressing normally, and to offer reassurance about the timeline of healing. Perhaps most importantly, Recovery was seen as a gift rather than an achievement. People didn't beat illness through willpower or superior treatment. They were fortunate enough to experience the body's remarkable ability to heal itself when provided with proper care, rest, and support. This understanding created gratitude rather than pride, appreciation rather than entitlement. The complete return to health was marked not by dramatic announcements, but by the simple integration back into daily life. Working, eating, sleeping, and participating in family activities without conscious thought about recovery, because wellness had quietly resumed its rightful place. Community and faith. The village as extended family villages in medieval winter weren't just collections of houses scattered across the landscape. They were living organisms where everyone knew everyone else's business. Not out of nosiness, but out of the fundamental understanding that survival was a team sport where individual success was inseparable from collective well-being. This wasn't the romantic community of modern imagination, where neighbors shared cheerful conversations over garden fences, but something more essential, the network of mutual dependence, where your neighbor's failure to properly store grain might mean your family went hungry if the winter lasted longer than expected, and where your success in preserving meat might be the difference between community survival and community suffering. The invisible threads connecting households were strongest during winter, when the harsh reality of the season stripped away any pretense that families could make it entirely on their own. When the widow Margaret's roof began leaking in January, it wasn't charity that brought neighbors to help with repairs. It was practical understanding that a collapsed roof in the middle of winter could mean death. And death had a way of affecting the entire community's morale and resources. Information flowed through villages like water finding its own level, who was running low on firewood, whose children were showing signs of illness, which families had managed their food stores particularly well. This wasn't gossip, but essential intelligence that allowed the community to function as a larger survival unit. When old Henrik mentioned casually that his grain stores were lower than hoped, it wasn't long before neighbors were quietly offering to share what they could spare. The sharing wasn't always dramatic or even acknowledged directly. A family might find an extra bundle of firewood appearing near their door after a particularly cold night, with no one claiming credit for the gesture. Children might be invited to share meals at neighbors' houses when their own family's food stores were running thin, with everyone pretending it was simply normal social interaction rather than subtle community support. Skills and tools were community resources that happened to be housed in individual families. The village's best axe might belong to one household, but everyone understood it would be shared when needed. The woman who had the most experience with difficult childbirths would be called upon when any family faced that challenge, regardless of previous relationships or minor disputes. Winter work often became community projects that strengthened both practical outcomes and social bonds. When major repairs were needed, fixing a collapsed shed, replacing a section of fencing, clearing snow from shared paths, the work would attract helpers who understood that community infrastructure served everyone's interests. These work sessions became social events where news was shared, problems discussed, and relationships maintained during a season when casual visiting was limited by weather. The village's social hierarchy existed, but operated differently during winter survival mode. Wealth and status mattered less when everyone was dealing with the same basic challenges of staying warm and fed. The richest family still needed help when their chimney collapsed, and the poorest family might have crucial skills or resources that benefited everyone. Winter had a way of leveling social distinctions through shared vulnerability. Children learned community values through observation and participation rather than formal instruction. They saw their parents sharing resources without expectation of immediate return, helping neighbors without being asked, and prioritizing community needs when they conflicted with individual desires. These lessons were absorbed naturally through daily example rather than explicit teaching. Conflicts weren't forgotten during winter, but they were set aside in favor of larger survival concerns. The neighbor who had disputed property boundaries in summer would still help repair your roof in winter. Understanding that feuds were luxuries that harsh seasons couldn't accommodate, personal disagreements were temporarily suspended in favor of community cohesion. The village's collective knowledge was its greatest resource. Older residents possessed decades of experience with weather patterns, food preservation, and survival strategies. Middle-aged adults brought practical skills and energy. Young people provided strength and optimism. Children contributed enthusiasm and the kind of observations that sometimes revealed solutions that experience had overlooked. Decision-making happened organically rather than through formal processes. When community action was needed, discussions would emerge naturally through daily interactions at the well, during shared work projects, in brief conversations between households. Consensus developed gradually, without votes or formal meetings, as people talked through problems and gradually aligned around practical solutions. The community's support wasn't unconditional. It was earned through participation, reciprocity, and demonstration of good faith effort to contribute to collective well-being. Families who consistently took without giving, who hoarded resources while neighbors struggled, or who created problems rather than solving them, would gradually find themselves excluded from the informal networks of mutual support. But for those who participated fully in community life, the village provided a safety net that transformed individual vulnerability into collective strength. Knowing that neighbors would help during crises, that resources would be shared during shortages, and that support would be available during difficult times created a sense of security that no individual household could achieve alone. This wasn't idealistic cooperation, but practical collaboration, born from the understanding that in a world where winter could kill and resources were always limited, community wasn't just pleasant, it was essential for survival itself. The church, sanctuary of hope and routine. The church in medieval winter wasn't just a building where people gathered for weekly services, it was the village's spiritual and social heartbeat. The place where individual struggles were transformed into shared faith, and where the harsh realities of winter were balanced against the promise of something greater, warmer, and more permanent than any earthly season. The building itself made no promises about comfort. Stone walls, minimal heating, and the kind of draft that seemed to have been professionally trained to find the gap between your cloak and your neck created an environment where worship required the same kind of physical endurance that characterized most medieval activities. But somehow, gathering together in that cold space created warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Sunday services became community events that extended far beyond religious observance. They were opportunities for news sharing, social connection, and the kind of collective experience that reminded everyone they weren't facing winter's challenges alone. Families would arrive bundled in whatever warm clothing they possessed, creating a congregation that looked like a gathering of colorful, moving blankets punctuated by visible breath and the occasional sound of teeth chattering. The Mass itself was conducted in Latin that most parishioners couldn't understand, but understanding wasn't really the point. The familiar rhythm of the service, the repetitive responses that everyone knew by heart, and the shared participation in rituals that connected them to something larger than their immediate circumstances created comfort through routine and community rather than intellectual comprehension. Singing provided one of winter's most precious gifts, the opportunity to create beauty together during a season when beauty was often scarce. Voices joined in hymns that everyone knew, creating harmonies that rose from the congregation like warmth rising from a well-tended fire. Children learned these songs before they could fully understand the words, absorbing melodies and meanings through repetition and community participation. The priest served as more than a religious leader, he was the community's connection to the larger world, its repository of learning, and often its most reliable source of comfort during difficult times. His sermons addressed not just spiritual concerns, but practical matters of community life, offering guidance on how faith could support families through winter's challenges. Prayer requests became a form of community care coordination. When someone was ill, struggling with food shortages, or facing other difficulties, The congregation would be asked to pray for them, but this often translated into practical support as well. Prayers for the sick would be accompanied by visits, assistance with daily tasks, and offers of whatever help the community could provide. The church calendar provided structure to winter's seemingly endless days, saints' feast days, periods of fasting and celebration, and the gradual progression towards spring's religious festivals created anticipation and variation in what could otherwise become monotonous survival routines. These observances weren't just spiritual exercises, but psychological supports that helped communities endure long winters. Religious festivals during winter were carefully designed to provide hope and celebration during the season's darkest months. Christmas wasn't just a religious holiday, but a community celebration that brought light, special foods, and social gathering during the depths of winter. These celebrations required planning and resource sharing that strengthened community bonds while providing something to anticipate during difficult times. Confession provided a form of psychological relief that extended beyond spiritual concerns. The opportunity to speak privately about worries, mistakes, and fears, and to receive assurance of forgiveness and understanding offered emotional support that was particularly valuable during the stress and isolation of winter months. The priest's role as counselor was as important as his religious functions. The church building served multiple community functions beyond formal religious services. It might host community meetings, provide shelter during severe storms, or serve as a gathering place for important discussions. The space belonged to everyone, creating a sense of shared ownership and responsibility that extended beyond religious observance. Religious instruction for children happened not just through formal teaching, but through the rhythm of community worship and the integration of faith into daily life. Children learn prayers, stories, and moral teachings through participation rather than classroom instruction, absorbing religious knowledge as naturally as they learned other community customs and traditions. The promise of heaven provided crucial psychological support during times when earthly life was particularly challenging. The understanding that winter's hardships were temporary, that suffering had meaning, and that better times awaited both in spring and in eternity gave people strength to endure difficulties that might otherwise seem overwhelming. But perhaps most importantly, the church created a space where individual burdens became shared concerns. When families struggled, the entire community was called to respond. When tragedy struck, grief was collective rather than isolated. When celebrations were possible, joy was multiplied through sharing. Faith in medieval times wasn't separate from daily life but woven throughout it, providing meaning to suffering, context for struggle, and hope for improvement. The church served as both the symbol and the practical center of this integration, creating a space where winter's harsh realities were acknowledged but placed within a larger framework of purpose, community, and ultimate hope. In a world where so much was uncertain weather, food supplies, health, survival itself, faith provided the one certainty that couldn't be taken away, the understanding that life had meaning beyond immediate circumstances in that community. Love and hope were stronger than any winter. Celebrations in the darkness, finding light in winter. Medieval winter celebrations weren't about elaborate festivities or abundant resources. They were about the remarkable human ability to create light, warmth, and joy using whatever materials were available, transforming ordinary evenings into special occasions through the alchemy of community spirit and shared determination to find reasons for happiness. Christmas marked the most important celebration of the winter season, not because families could afford elaborate gifts or feasts, but because it represented hope during the darkest time of year. The promise of light returning to the world resonated particularly strongly with people who were literally waiting for longer days and the eventual return of spring. Preparations were modest but meaningful, perhaps a special meal using carefully hoarded ingredients, the crafting of simple gifts from available materials, or the sharing of preserved treats that had been saved for this occasion. Children played central roles in winter celebrations, their natural enthusiasm and wonder transforming simple activities into magical experiences. They might help create decorations from natural materials, evergreen branches, berry clusters, or items crafted from scraps of cloth and wood. Their excitement about small treats or modest gifts reminded adults that celebration was more about attention and intention than about the monetary value of what was shared. Saint days throughout the winter provided smaller but still significant reasons for special observances. These might involve preparing particular foods, telling specific stories, or engaging in traditional activities that connected families to larger cultural traditions. Each celebration was an opportunity to break the routine of survival with something that felt festive and hopeful. Music and storytelling became the entertainment that required no resources beyond human creativity and memory. Families would gather for evenings of songs, stories, and simple games that provided entertainment while strengthening social bonds. These activities created warmth through participation rather than consumption, generating their own form of wealth that couldn't be measured in material terms. Community celebrations brought households together for shared experiences that multiplied individual resources through cooperation. When families contributed small amounts to communal feasts, the result was meals that felt abundant even when individual contributions were modest. The act of celebration itself became more important than the specific foods or activities involved. Even the smallest observances, saying special prayers, sharing preserved fruits, telling traditional stories created breaks in winter's routine that reminded families that life contained beauty and meaning beyond mere survival. These moments of celebration provided psychological warmth that was as essential as physical warmth for maintaining hope and morale during challenging seasons. The ability to celebrate with limited resources became a form of wealth in itself, with understanding that happiness could be created through attention, intention, and community rather than through abundance or luxury. This wisdom transformed winter from mere endurance into a season that contained its own forms of richness and reward. Chapter 7: The Gentle Creatures. Medieval wildlife as neighbors and companions. 7.1 Domestic animals, the four-legged family members. 600 words. Medieval domestic animals weren't just livestock. They were family members with different dietary requirements, questionable table manners, and occasionally strong opinions about household management. Each species brought its own personality to the winter household, creating a domestic ecosystem where humans and animals collaborated in the ancient art of mutual survival. Chickens were the village gossips, keenly interested in everyone's business and completely unashamed about expressing their views on current events. They approached winter with the practical philosophy that comfort was a basic right, not a luxury, and they expected their human companions to acknowledge this truth. During cold snaps, they would appear at doors with the confidence of regular customers at their favorite establishment, clearly expecting admission to the warmth and perhaps a small snack to acknowledge their patience. These feathered residents had strong opinions about sleeping arrangements and weren't shy about expressing them. They preferred elevated positions near but not too near the fire, locations that provided warmth without risk of accidental roasting. Children often became chicken translators, learning to interpret the subtle differences between "I'm cold clucks," "Where's breakfast clucks," and "something interesting is happening outside clucks." Pigs were the philosophers of the medieval household, approaching life with the kind of serene acceptance that suggested they understood something profound about the nature of existence. They generated impressive amounts of heat while maintaining surprisingly clean personal habits, making them ideal winter roommates for families who could accommodate their physical presence and occasional commentary on daily events. Their intelligence made them fascinating companions during long winter evenings. Pigs seemed to understand household routines and would position themselves strategically for maximum comfort, while somehow managing to stay out of the way of essential human activities. They observed family life with the kind of patient attention that suggested they were taking notes for future reference. Goats approached indoor living with the supreme confidence of creatures who had always known that proper housing arrangements would eventually be recognized by their human staff. They had opinions about everything: bedding quality, meal timing, the appropriateness of various family members' behavior, and they expressed these opinions through a sophisticated communication system that included facial expressions, strategic positioning, and precisely timed vocalizations. Children often develop particularly strong relationships with goats, perhaps recognizing kindred spirits in creatures who were simultaneously independent and social, practical and playful. Goats seem to understand that children were allies in the ongoing negotiation between animal comfort and adult human priorities. Cows, when families were fortunate enough to have them, brought a sense of maternal stability to winter households. They were patient observers of human activity, offering gentle presence and the kind of calm that comes from creatures who understand that most problems resolve themselves given sufficient time and proper attention. Their contribution of milk during winter months made them particularly valued family members, honored for their generosity and cared for with special attention. The practical benefits of animal cohabitation extended far beyond warmth generation. These creatures provided fresh food throughout winter: eggs from chickens, milk from goats or cows that supplemented preserved foods with essential nutrition. Their presence also created structure for daily routines, providing regular tasks that helped organize winter days that might otherwise stretch endlessly. But perhaps the most valuable contribution these animal companions made was emotional. Their simply being there, breathing, moving, occasionally making gentle sounds, added life to homes that might otherwise feel empty during long winter evenings. They provided something to care for beyond immediate family, expanding the circle of concern and responsibility in ways that strengthened rather than burdened household life. The relationship between humans and domestic animals during medieval winter was one of genuine partnership. Each species contributed what they could to collective survival and comfort, creating households that were richer, warmer, and more vibrant than either humans or animals could have achieved alone. These weren't pets in the modern sense, but true collaborators in the essential work of making it through winter together. 7.2 Wild Visitors, the Forest Neighbors. 500 words. The forest animals were like distant neighbors who occasionally dropped by uninvited, sometimes welcome, sometimes concerning, but generally more interested in their own survival than in causing trouble for the humans who shared their landscape. Most of the time, wildlife and people maintained a respectful distance. Each group focused on the challenging work of making it through winter with minimal interference from the other. Foxes were the neighborhood scouts, intelligent and adaptable creatures who understood that human settlements offered certain opportunities for resourceful individuals willing to take calculated risks. They moved through villages like shadows, investigating chicken coops with the professional interest of security consultants, evaluating potential weaknesses. Their presence was usually detected through tracks in the snow rather than direct sightings, evidence of their careful reconnaissance missions. Rather than being purely predatory threats, foxes seemed to understand the concept of sustainable relationships. They might take an occasional chicken, but rarely in ways that devastated entire flocks. It was more like an informal tax system, where humans provided occasional meals in exchange for foxes helping to control the rodent population that could otherwise damage stored grains. Deer appeared at the edges of settlements like shy visitors who were curious about human activities but preferred to observe from a safe distance. During particularly harsh winters, they might venture closer to homes, drawn by the scent of stored hay or the warmth radiating from buildings. These appearances were often viewed as good omens, signs that the natural world was enduring winter's challenges with the same patient determination as human families. Rabbits and hares provided occasional excitement and protein when they could be successfully caught, but they were respected for their cleverness and survival skills. Children often watched these creatures with admiration, learning lessons about agility, alertness, and the art of disappearing quickly when circumstances became threatening. Birds maintained their own complex relationships with human settlements. Ravens and crows demonstrated remarkable intelligence, seeming to understand human routines and appearing at times when food scraps might be available. Rather than being ominous presences, They were often viewed as clever neighbors who had figured out how to benefit from proximity to human activities without becoming dependent on them. Smaller songbirds that remained through winter were welcomed as signs of life and resilience during the season's quieter months. Their presence around homes suggested that the environment remained healthy and balanced, that the ecosystem was functioning even during its most challenging season. Owls provided natural pest control services, helping to manage rodent populations that could otherwise become serious problems for families trying to preserve food stores through winter. The sound of owls hunting at night was often reassuring rather than frightening, indicating that natural systems were working to maintain balance. The relationship between humans and wild animals during medieval winter was characterized more by coexistence than conflict. Both groups were focused on survival. Both understood the challenges of the season, and both had developed strategies for making it through difficult months. Rather than seeing wildlife as threats to be eliminated, medieval people generally understood them as neighbors with whom they shared the landscape and the common goal of surviving until spring returned. This understanding created a more harmonious relationship with the natural world, where humans lived as part of the ecosystem rather than in opposition to it. Yeah. Nearsom 7.3, The Art of Coexistence. 400 words. Medieval families developed a sophisticated understanding of how to live alongside the creatures with whom they shared both their homes and their landscape, creating relationships based on mutual respect, practical accommodation, and the recognition that survival was often easier when different species worked together rather than against each other. The key to successful coexistence was understanding that animals had their own needs, preferences, and behavioral patterns that could be worked with rather than fought against. Families learned to read animal signals, recognizing when chickens were genuinely alarmed versus when they were simply expressing opinions. Understanding what goat behavior indicated contentment versus distress, knowing when animal restlessness suggested real threats versus temporary discomfort. Boundaries were established through gentle consistency rather than harsh enforcement. Animals learned household rules through patient repetition and clear consequences, while humans adapted their routines to accommodate animal needs and behaviors. This created a dynamic balance where both species could coexist comfortably without constant conflict or stress. Feeding schedules became community events that strengthened bonds between humans and animals, while ensuring that everyone's nutritional needs were met as fairly as possible given available resources. Animals learned to anticipate these routines, gathering at appropriate times and places without needing to be called or coerced. Space sharing was negotiated through practical arrangement rather than rigid segregation. Families learned to create the areas where animals could be comfortable without interfering with the essential human activities, while animals learned to respect boundaries that kept them safe from fire, tools, and other household hazards. The seasonal rhythm of indoor-outdoor living was managed with flexibility that acknowledged both animal preferences and weather reality values. Animals were given choices when possible, doors left open so they could move between indoor and outdoor spaces as comfort dictated. Sleeping areas arranged to accommodate different temperature preferences. Children played crucial roles as intermediaries between adult humans and animals, often developing intuitive understanding of animal communication and needs. Their natural empathy and patience made them excellent animal caregivers, while their relationships with animals taught them valuable lessons about responsibility, compassion, and the complexities of caring for others. The success of coexistence was measured not by perfect harmony, which was neither expected nor possible, but by the creation of households where humans and animals could live together with minimal stress and maximum mutual benefit. This required ongoing adjustment, patience, and the understanding that relationships with animals, like relationships with humans, required attention, respect, and genuine care to flourish. The result was homes that felt more alive, more vibrant, and more complete than either species could have achieved alone, creating a model of interspecies cooperation that served everyone's interest during winter's challenging months. Waiting for spring in medieval times was an art form that required a particular kind of patience, not the anxious waiting of watching a pot boil or counting down to an important event, but the deep, settled patience of someone who understands that all things come to those who endure with grace, and that grace itself could be cultivated through the gentle practice of accepting what cannot be changed. By February, winter had long since stopped being a novelty and had settled into its role as the season that seemed to have forgotten how to end. The initial challenges of autumn preparation and early winter survival had given way to something more subtle, but equally demanding the psychological endurance required to maintain hope and sanity during months when every day felt remarkably similar to the one before. Time moved differently during these deepest winter months, flowing like thick honey rather than rushing like summer streams. Days were short but somehow felt long, marked more by the progression of small tasks than by dramatic events or significant changes. Families developed routines that created structure in what could otherwise feel like an endless stretch of similar days. The rhythm of waiting took on its own gentle cadence. Morning fires were lit with the same care as always, but now with the accumulated wisdom of months of practice. Meals were prepared with ingredients that had been carefully rationed to last through this exact period. Daily tasks were completed with the kind of settled competence that comes from having performed them hundreds of times under similar circumstances. Conversation during these waiting months took on different qualities than earlier winter discussions. There was less planning, less anticipation of immediate changes, and more focus on small observations, gentle humor, and the kind of philosophical reflection that emerges when daily life becomes routine enough to allow deeper contemplation. Children's behavior during the long wait provided fascinating insights into human adaptability. Rather than becoming increasingly restless or difficult, many children seem to develop their own version of seasonal patience, finding entertainment in simpler activities, creating elaborate games from minimal materials, and demonstrating remarkable creativity in making the familiar feel fresh and interesting. Adults learn to find satisfaction in maintenance rather than progress, keeping fires burning well, maintaining household routines, preserving family harmony, caring for animals, and stored supplies. These weren't exciting accomplishments, but they represented the steady, unglamorous work that made survival possible and family life sustainable. The art of waiting involved learning to appreciate small variations within larger patterns of similarity. A day when the fire caught particularly well, an evening when the soup turned out especially tasty, a morning when everyone woke up feeling rested and content. These became noteworthy events, not because they were dramatic, but because they represented small improvements within the larger context of winter endurance. Families developed their own internal seasons within the larger season, creating rhythms and observances that marked the passage of time and provided structure for the long wait. Perhaps certain types of work were reserved for particular months, or storytelling traditions marked specific periods, or food preparation took on seasonal variations that helped distinguish one part of winter from another. The psychological challenge of waiting wasn't boredom, so much as the need to maintain hope and purpose during a period when external changes were minimal and progress was measured in survival rather than achievement. Families who navigated this successfully understood that winter's gift wasn't excitement, but the opportunity to develop inner resources, strengthen relationships, and discover the satisfaction that could be found in simple persistence. Mental preparation for spring began not as active planning, but as gentle anticipation, the kind of hopeful thinking that sustained morale without creating anxiety about timing or outcomes. Spring would come when it came, and until then, the task was simply to continue the patient work of living well within winter's constraints. This waiting was not passive, but deeply active, the active choice to find contentment within limitation, to create meaning within routine, and to maintain faith in change, even when change seemed impossibly distant. The first whispers of change. The signs of spring's approach in medieval times weren't dramatic announcements, but subtle whispers that required the kind of attention that comes from months of careful observation and patient waiting. These changes were so gradual that they might be missed entirely by someone not attuned to the gentle rhythms of seasonal transition. But for families who had spent months watching and waiting, they were as clear as written messages. The light changed first, though the difference was so subtle it was felt more than seen. Days that had seemed uniformly gray began to show hints of variation, perhaps a slightly different quality to the morning light, or the way shadows fell at midday with just a fraction more definition than they had possessed for months. These weren't dramatic improvements, but gentle shifts that suggested the sun was beginning to remember its way back toward longer days. Air temperature remained cold, but the quality of the cold began to shift from the bone-deep chill of deep winter to something that felt less permanent, less absolute. There were moments, brief intervals during sunny afternoons, when the air carried just the faintest suggestion that warmth was not merely a memory, but a future possibility. Snow patterns provided their own subtle indicators of change. Instead of the steady accumulation that characterized deep winter, snow began to show signs of occasional melting and refreezing, creating textures and surfaces that suggested the balance between freezing and thawing was beginning to shift. Even if temperatures still favored cold, animals offered some of the most reliable signs of coming change, their behavior shifting in ways that suggested they sensed seasonal transitions before humans could detect them. Chickens might begin laying eggs slightly more frequently, or domestic animals might show increased restlessness that suggested their internal clocks were responding to environmental changes too subtle for human perception. Wild birds provided particularly convincing evidence of seasonal transition. The return of species that had disappeared during the deepest winter months, or changes in the behavior of birds that had remained throughout the cold season, indicated that the natural world was beginning to respond to signals that spring was approaching, even if slowly. The rhythm of daily tasks began to feel different, though the tasks themselves remained largely unchanged. There was something in the quality of work, the feeling of maintenance activities, that suggested preparation for change rather than simply endurance through unchanging circumstances. Families might begin checking stored supplies with an eye toward rationing them through the remainder of winter, rather than stretching them indefinitely. Dreams and conversations began to include more references to spring activities, future planning, and possibilities beyond immediate survival. These weren't dramatic shifts, but gentle movements in the direction of thoughts and hopes that looked forward rather than simply focusing on present endurance. Sleep patterns might begin to shift slightly, responding to incremental changes in daylight hours that weren't yet dramatic enough to be consciously noticed, but were sufficient to influence natural rhythms. People might find themselves waking slightly earlier or feeling marginally more energetic during certain parts of the day. These first whispers of spring weren't promises that winter was ending immediately, but they were reassurances that winter would end eventually, that the waiting had purpose, and that the patience and endurance of the past months were investments in a future that was beginning, very gradually. To approach the quiet victory of survival in medieval winter wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and steady, like breathing. And the recognition of success came not through fanfare or celebration, but through the simple realization that you had made it through another winter. Not because you were heroic, but because you were human. And humans, it turned out, possessed remarkable capacity for endurance when endurance was what circumstances required. The moment of understanding that winter was truly ending arrived differently for different families in different years. Sometimes it was the first day when snow melted more than it accumulated. Sometimes it was the appearance of the first green shoots in protected areas around the house. Sometimes it was simply waking up one morning and realizing that the quality of light, air, and general atmosphere had shifted from winter's patient endurance to spring's gentle awakening. There were no medals for surviving winter, no awards for successful resource management or community cooperation. The victory was personal and collective, measured not in achievements, but in the simple fact of continued existence, continued family unity, and the preservation of hope through months when hope was sometimes the most challenging resource to maintain. Children who had grown through the winter looked subtly different, not just older, but more competent, more patient, more understanding of the relationship between careful planning and successful outcomes. They had learned lessons about resource management, community cooperation, and personal resilience that no formal education could have provided. Adults carried the satisfaction of having successfully managed complex challenges with limited resources, having maintained family stability through difficult circumstances, and having contributed to community survival through months when individual and collective well-being were inseparable. The skills developed during winter: patience, resourcefulness, cooperation, and the ability to find satisfaction in simple accomplishments weren't just survival tools, but life skills that improved the quality of existence regardless of season or circumstance. Most importantly, families who successfully navigated winter together had strengthened bonds that would serve them throughout the coming year and future winters. They had learned that they could depend on each other, that they could find ways to solve problems cooperatively, and that they possessed inner resources that could sustain them through difficult periods. Spring's arrival would bring new challenges and opportunities, but it would find families who had proven to themselves and their communities that they possessed the capacity for both individual resilience and collective cooperation that made not just survival but thriving possible. The quiet victory of winter survival was the foundation for everything that would follow: the confidence that challenges could be met, that resources could be managed wisely, and that community and family bonds were strong enough to support whatever future seasons might bring. The gentle lesson. And so they waited, and so they endured, and so they found small joys in the midst of great challenges, creating a legacy that extends far beyond their particular place and time. These medieval families remind us that happiness isn't the absence of difficulty, it's the presence of community, the warmth of shared struggles, and the quiet confidence that spring always returns, even after the longest, coldest winters. Their lives teach us something profound about the relationship between limitation and creativity, between challenge and character, between individual survival and collective thriving. They discovered that comfort wasn't about having everything they wanted, but about finding contentment with what they had. That security wasn't about eliminating all risks, but about developing the skills and relationships that could meet risk successfully. Perhaps most remarkably, they learned that time itself could be a gift rather than a burden when approached with patience and purpose. Their slower pace wasn't about lacking ambition, but about understanding that some of life's most important work, building relationships, developing character, creating meaning, happens gradually and can't be rushed through technological solutions or increased efficiency. Their approach to winter survival reveals insights that remain relevant in our world of different but equally real challenges. They understood that resilience comes not from individual strength, but from community support. That wisdom emerges from accepting what cannot be changed while working creatively with what can be influenced. And that satisfaction often comes from doing simple things well, rather than from achieving dramatic successes. The medieval winter teaches us about the value of preparation, but not the anxious preparation that attempts to control every variable. Instead, it's the thoughtful preparation that does what can reasonably be done and then trusts in human adaptability, community resources, and the fundamental resilience that emerges when people face challenges together. Their ability to find meaning in maintenance, keeping fires burning, preserving food stores, caring for animals and family members, reminds us that much of life's essential work isn't glamorous or dramatic, but requires the kind of steady attention and commitment that creates the foundation for everything else that matters. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your warm bed, with heat available at the touch of a thermostat and food accessible whenever hunger calls, perhaps you can carry with you some of their patience, their resilience, and their ability to find comfort in simple things: a fire that catches well, a meal shared with people you care about, the quiet satisfaction of useful work completed with attention and care. Rest well, knowing that you carry within you the same strength that sustained them through their long winters, the strength that will carry you through whatever seasons lie ahead. Because in the end, surviving winter isn't about conquering cold or defeating hardship. It's about discovering that humans possess remarkable capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and hope, and that even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring. sweet dreams, and may your own winters be filled with the gentle warmth that comes from patience, community, and the quiet confidence that difficult seasons, like all seasons, are temporary, but the strength we develop during them can last a lifetime.